tribe and history of an important piece in time that the tribe went through during this period. So it's from my own experience, it's from my time that I've spent around people that you'll hear me talk about here today. Just about everybody that you'll hear me reference in this presentation today I've known through my career and learned from them. So that's kind of my preface on why I'm up here talking to you. There are many people, even in this room, that could probably do this better than I and know a lot more about this. I was invited to do it. I'm not going to pass it up. I enjoy getting opportunities to speak to people at periods of time about our tribe's history, about our tribe's management. So I never pass it up when asked, and I shouldn't. So the other thing that I wanted to make sure you all had, and I know you've done the tours yesterday, and you've met a lot of people. You had Ron, who's excellent at giving tours, as you all probably realized, and an excellent manager, Dave Greeno, his staff. But one thing that we're taught as leaders of the tribe is when people gather here on the reservation that we make sure they're welcome. So if that didn't happen and you didn't feel like that was extended, then that's something that we do formally. Take that time to do that now that you're on Menominee land. And when we have people on Menominee land, just like when we visit other tribal lands, we thank them for allowing us to be there. So I just want to make sure that you feel welcome for being here at Menominee and things you've seen, and people that have welcomed you. So hopefully you feel that, and again, I'll extend a welcome to you to Menominee territory here. So welcome. So I'm going to talk to you today about a period in time that was very tumultuous for Menominee, a very tough period. In order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about our history, and you've heard a lot of our history already. So there's going to be a little bit of duplication here, but it's a little bit of a different reason. It's important to understand why we're here, why Menominees are here, and the importance of the land that led up to these periods that were so very tough for Menominees. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that history. What you've heard already is a lot about our forest, our sustainability that you hear whenever Menominee is mentioned. I've traveled a lot of places in this country in my trials and tribulations, and everywhere we go and we meet tribal leadership or we meet people that know of Menominee, first thing we mention is our forest, noted for our forest and our sustainability. That's true. One thing that I like to tell groups like this when I get a chance, though, is that sustainability isn't just about the forest, and you kind of heard that from Bill. There's levels of that forest that are also sustainable and have also survived and are also benefit from our management and our history, those things that were handed down to us from our past generations. So those things like the water, really important to Menominee. There's special ceremonies that we do just to honor that water. That's part of benefit of being sustainable. And water benefits from that. Those plants that are under that story, that canopy that you've seen and witnessed yourselves out on that tour, those are benefits of our sustainability. And I know Jeff talked a lot about that in his work, about those under plants and the messages and the stories and the lessons that we learn from them. So all of them things are important. It's not just about that forest that you can see, but it's about the life underneath there that we sustain. The other thing with our history is that tribes are really oral history based. And Menominee is no different. Through our history, we're oral history based. So the things that we learned from our past generations and our past leaders, especially the older ones, older times, the prehistoric times, were in our stories and our legends, and not necessarily written down. So you can't go to a book and open it up and read about some of our stories and some of our legends, and you just didn't. That's the way Native people taught. Those were handed down to generations through those stories, through the times and in longhouses, in ceremonies, making baskets, There were times when stories were told, but not necessarily written down. So when settlement happened, the one thing that could be attributed to those that came here, that Dr. O mentioned, those first ones that arrived that we met on the banks of Green Bay, that they're attributed to a lot of things like settlement, pushing Native people around. One thing they did do was wrote stuff down. So we had ability to establish those records and look at those records, and still today go back to those records. All of you historians that are in the room, and all of you people that are experts in that, learn a lot from those records that were written down. Otherwise, the way we get it is from talking to our elders and listening to them stories. So as everybody knows, that's where we are. There's the star on the map here in northeast Wisconsin. And again, it can be a little repetitive. If you guys have seen this probably more than twice now, so here it is again. But again, it's important to point this out because it's part of our history, part of our landscape, part of our being that Menominees were on this landscape. The oldest residents of Wisconsin, over 10,000 years. And again, the areas we occupy, 10 million acres of area. There weren't states, obviously, but what's now today Wisconsin, Upper Michigan, our main occupation, our main areas. You can see the treaties here, those hashed and colored lines. You've seen this map before. You heard Bill talk about it. I'm sure you heard Dave talk about it as well. So you can see how much land that we occupied and what that took for the government to get that land out of Menominee hands after settlement. And again, some pretty valuable areas in our treaty ceded territories. Treaty of the Cedars up there in 1836. That is now part of Upper Michigan, and also includes the Menominee River. Very historic place. Obviously, it would be called the Menominee River if it wasn't important to us. That's how it got there. And again, today's reservation right there. Originally, all of those townships were included, and I'll show you another map of that in a little bit on how that got further divided. So this is another aspect of that settlement area of our historic territory. What this depicts is the area we occupied, but it's going to be hard to see. I know there are little black dots associated on this map. You can look and see them. Those black dots in the making of this map depicted many of our settlement areas, many of our Menominee villages that were documented when the Europeans first arrived here. Those black dots were mainstays for Menominee people in the Menominee Tribe. You can see one thing that's really common to those settlement areas and then encampments and villages. So if anybody can recognize it, just tell me what's associated with those black dots. Just go ahead and shout out. What are they most commonly associated with? Water. Yep. And again, it's not a secret why water is important to us, and I'll talk more about that a little later. But that's where Menominees were. Why? Because we were hunting, fishing, and gathering. And as you heard, we're also associating that with agriculture. So we know for a fact up here, we were doing agriculture. There's raised garden beds up there, as Dr. Overstreet talked about, right along the Menominee River. But as well, throughout, in a lot of it, doesn't exist anymore. You just can't find it because of development, that it's gone. So yeah, that was the main thing I wanted to point out there in regard to that. So again, some duplication. So you're going to see this. Yeah. You've seen this map a lot. You're going to continue to see it again. I know Ron's going to enlighten you on some of this afternoon from the forestry perspective, and you've heard him already. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the satellite photo, but again, just a massive attribution of what Menominee has done with its lands of the reservation. And again, in 1854, if you remember, there was a treaty, the Treaty of the Wolf River. So in 1854, that reservation I pointed at on that map before is this place that you're on today. And since 1854 and before, we've taken care of that land because that's our responsibility. You can see what that means to us, and it's realized when you view it in person or when you view it at views like this from space, that you can literally see our boundaries. There's a map of the reservation. So it's pretty cool that you just realize that how well we've done with our forestry program, but again, as a people, we do that to take care of our people, not just because there's a forest there, but because that's the Menominee way. Menominees were taught that by folks like Chief Oshkosh. Chief Oshkosh was also important in our history because he had a lot to do with the establishment of the Treaty of the Wolf River and the establishment of our reservation. Dave, I'm sure, talked about that. So, not having to go to Minnesota, Crow Wing County today is where that place would have been, that Menominee would have been forced to go to, like many other tribes in this country that were forced to move. Forced to reside on lands that weren't their homelands and didn't have a choice. Our leaders like Chief Oshkosh helped us avoid that and fought hard to make sure we stayed in our homelands here in Wisconsin. Why? Because the Wolf River was here. Why? Because the forest was here. Why? Because there were lake sturgeon here, and that didn't exist. And the other thing that they recognized, going to Minnesota and having the opportunity to travel there, literally travel to Minnesota to look at lands that were being proposed to be moved to, and realize there were other tribes there. There were other nations there that weren't Menominee. That was their lands, not ours. And this is where we belong. So again, all of this is important in the message and the story that I'm telling you today. So, start the background on some of this. So the Menominee gets congressional permission to sue their trustee in the U.S. Court of Claims, filed in 1935, in court for 16 years. So what that means is our trustee, the United States government, of course, that trustee, being held our lands for us to manage, and in the times moving forward after 1854 in our treaty, those lands were being managed for forestry primarily. There was agriculture going on. That's been demonstrated here today. We had a lot of multiple uses within the reservation. We were gathering everything, doing agriculture, gathering berries, hunting, fishing. That was our way of life. But forestry was a big component of this. In 1907, the Follett Act was passed to allow Menominee to continue economically managing a forest and developing a mill. So we had a congressional act that allowed us to do that, which is significant. You hear this story as well. So during that period, the government was managing. The tribe in the early years wasn't allowed to harvest itself the trees that the government was managing that for us. So in the 1920s, maybe a bit before that, there was a lot of cutting going on. And if you looked at Chief Oshkosh's vision and what Ron will tell you about after lunch in the forestry vision that Chief Oshkosh had, it's all about sustainability and having a forest that's going to be there forever, perpetuity. Not all the species, of course, they'll change greatly, depending on which one, but overall, in the satellite picture you saw. So the government chose to let some of that land be managed in a fashion that wasn't sustainable. It was clear cut. So that's what the tribe was concerned about. And again, the messages you heard, the presentations before me were all about that. Menominee's caring for the land, looking after those grandfather trees and everything that grew below them. So in knowing that was the way we were managing, seeing what was happening, we had fortitude to take the government to task. So in 1951, the U.S. Court of Claims awards the tribe $8.5 million for BIA's mismanagement of our trust assets. And all told, at the end of the court case, it ended up to be about $10 million that the tribe successfully navigated. Remember, we're talking about 1935, not that long after treaties, if you really put it in perspective, and not that long after the government was forcing tribes to settle, that we were able to navigate this. So that $10 million, unfortunately, was a U.S. Treasury award, so that our money was put in U.S. Treasury. And being in U.S. Treasury, the restriction on it was it couldn't be spent until congressional approval was given. So to understand that further, and I've talked about this a little bit already, but to understand that further, you have to put it in perspective. So some of these years that you see up here in this timeline really do put it in perspective. It started in 1887. These were all attempts by the government to repress Native people. And why would they do that? Because of the threats of the land bases that we held nationwide. Treaties were in place, sure. Some of those treaties were millions of acres to tribes, especially in the West. Menominee gave up millions for about 300-some thousand acres at the time. So really a small fraction. But nonetheless, there was still interest in the government in those lands. So in things in 1887, like the Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, that act was passed by the government to take land from tribes. The auspice of the Dawes Act was to give land to tribes, to give land to individual tribal members so they could use that land how they chose, but the auspice was to have them farm that land. And again, listening to the story that you've heard already, we weren't farmers. We did agriculture, but not farmers, not in the sense that the Allotment Act wanted farming to happen. So that it cost many tribes throughout the country millions of acres of land. Today, in Wisconsin, at least in most other places, it became known as checkerboarding reservations, because that land was taken out of trust, taken out of the tribe's ability to ask their trustee to help them manage that land. It was taken away. Menominee was fortunate in this regard because we had a lot of good people that had a lot of foresight in our leadership. But also we had our forest. So today still, I think we're on maybe 98% forested. Yeah. So about 98% forested, I think it's the number we usually use. And then that 98% was being managed for forest, purely and primarily forested. So we were able to work with other agencies like U.S. Forest Service, who helped us avoid that Dawes Act impact within our reservation. And today, we are not a checkerboard reservation. Our boundaries are contiguous. And within our boundaries, other than what you're going to hear me tell you about, as a result of a different act, we have trust land entirely within the boundaries of the reservation. So also, there were things like the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, that the government implemented to force tribes to go with constitutions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more also when I talk about ours. And of course, in 1953, the Termination Act, there was one other piece in there that was known as assimilation. So the assimilation attempts by the government were an effort congressionally approved to move tribal members off their reservations. So move off their reservations into larger cities. And the word is assimilation, but basically what the government wanted from tribal members was to make them citizens like city people were. So to go to those areas and live like those city people live, and not like natives, and not like hunter, fisher, gatherers, and people that lived on our reservations and lived this way of life that we lived for millennia. So that's what the Assimilation Act was doing. And you'll hear me reference this as I go through the presentation, because Menominee had a number of folks move to larger cities, close to us though, fairly close to us, Milwaukee and Chicago primarily. And today we have communities in Milwaukee and Chicago. So we have tribal members living in those cities that now are our generations, that in this time were forced to do that. Forced by the offer of money. We will pay you to go to the city and become citizens down there and act like everybody else does. We will give you payments to do that. You know, in impoverished nations, a lot of people thought that was an opportunity, that was something good for us. Also at the bottom there's passage of PL 280 that was a little more complicated. So Public Law 280 basically is a jurisdictional law that was passed on many reservations. It took jurisdiction away from the tribes, civil and criminal jurisdiction, and it gave it to the states. So Public Law 280 allows states to come into reservations and enforce laws on not only non-members, but on tribal members within reservations. Menominee, again, resisted PL 280. We're the only tribe in Wisconsin to be non-PL 280. So within our boundaries, we have jurisdiction over non-members, and we have criminal jurisdiction over all tribal members, whether they're Menominee or not. And that's not the case throughout the rest of Wisconsin. So the Menominee Termination Act, or the Termination Act, as it's also known, passed in 1953. Menominee was one of the 109 tribes slated for termination. Menominee was the first because it was so advanced. You know, we were benefiting economically, as I mentioned. You know, in the early 1900s already, we were logging and running a lumber mill for the benefit of our tribe and our tribal members. That didn't go unnoticed. There are other tribes terminated across the country as the states. Klamath is a large tribe in Oregon. Who's ever visited there, you know, today it looks different because of termination. Another tribe in Oregon, the Siletz tribe, they lost 1 million acres of land due to termination, down to a tiny piece of land today that they have enough to reside their tribal members on in a casino. That's it. So in 1953, our tribal members were living, you know, impoverished, even though economically, financially, we were situated pretty well. Remember, we had a trust fund of $10 million sitting there. We had about $1 million in addition to that. That was also lumber, timber revenue. But still impoverished, low income, bad, poor housing. Health and education was struggling, and all of that fell below the national level in Wisconsin norms. This isn't an unusual story. You know, if you look at the statistics today, we're still struggling with that. In fact, and other tribes do as well. So healthcare is tough, education is tough, you know, housing is tough. Those are all expensive things that tribes battle with all over the country. But particularly like Menominee, it happens, and it happened historically. It's still a struggle today. So those things in 53 were there and present in forefront. So because of these financial needs, the tribe decided to distribute a portion of the 1951 Court of Claims judgment in the amount of $1,500 per tribal member. So that was the ask. The tribe got together, and there were a lot of discussions behind this, that $1,500 would help us in that time. Remember, this was the 50s. $1,500 today, that's pretty cool, but in the 50s, $1,500 was a lot of money. Again, needed congressional approval. So distribution approval, it passed the House. So congressmen like Joe McCarthy were in favor. But in the Senate, there was a senator by the name of Arthur Watkins, Republican from Utah. He was also the chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. How he got that position is beyond me, but folks that know this history probably know a lot better than I do. So he submitted an amendment to that passage that called for Menominee to submit determination before the $1,500 could be distributed. The result was confusion, deception, and a lack of understanding between tribal members and the federal government. And again, that wasn't a coincidence. It was meant to cause confusion, deception, and lack of understanding. And the senator knew that. So in '53, Watkins visited the reservation. He reported that Congress decided to terminate the tribe within 3 years, and they would not receive the $1,500 payment until after termination. So he stood in a room like this one, obviously not this nice, but he stood in a room here on a reservation somewhere and told a gathering of tribal members that you're going to be terminated and you're going to get your money. So in 1954, the Menominee were terminated from federal recognition. And again, ironically, as I told you about Chief Oshkosh and the successes we had there and the hard work that was done there, the leadership, ironically, 100 years after the Treaty of the Wolf River, the federal government terminated us. So what that meant for us was removal of all federal responsibility, and then releasing the U.S. government from obligations to protect tribal sovereignty. So that sounds like words, certainly, but I think everybody in this room knows that federal responsibilities and government responsibilities usually mean support, usually mean money, and that's what it meant to Menominee. In all tribes, all 109 other tribes that were terminated were sovereign, and their trustee was the federal government. And part of that was to fund programs, to fund social services, to fund healthcare, to fund schools. Even though Menominee was successfully doing that in a lot of those areas, we were dependent, just like other tribes were, on that support from the federal government. And Congress knew this. So when it came to home here and having to execute this move, and what tribal members thought were receiving their money was a vote. So on a hand vote of 169 to 5, which was 5% of our tribal membership, the senator reported that the tribe voted in favor of termination. Many tribal members thought they were voting in favor of the payment, and termination had already been decided. Because you got to remember what Watkins told them was when he came here, that you guys are terminated, but you'll get your money in 3 years once you vote. So the confusion and the deception were that many members thought they were voting in favor of the payment. Termination already decided. Congress passed the bill believing that it had been approved by tribal membership. So Congress' understanding was that the tribe's vote said, we're okay with termination, so go ahead, Congress, and finish that action. The act passed in 1954. President Eisenhower signed it. Tribal members received payment, but also closed the tribal rolls. So at that time in 1954, there would be no more enrolled Menominee members. Yeah, that's right, 54. So the closing the tribal rolls meant just that. So today, our membership is approaching 9,500, I believe. So pretty large. The government's plan was that in 1954, I think, Dave, do you remember what we had, 1,500 on roll at the time? 1,500 people or so at termination? Yeah, so at that point, the government's plan was to close the roll and there would bed no more tribal membership in that point. We wouldn't have 9,500 enrolled tribal members today. So that's pretty traumatic. The tribe had to submit a termination plan to provide for the future control of assets. Federal services ended and the reservation lands became subject to tax. So that plan took 7 years to complete. And remember now that federal responsibility was gone. So the responsibility to create that plan and develop that basis for a tax base was all put on the tribe. The tribe had to pay for all of these things. They had to pay for the people to help with the studies, to write the plan, to do the meetings, and it was part of the planning process. So that was right off the bat an onus on the tribe that was financial. Besides all of the social pain, the financial part was also part of that process, and part of that plan by Congress. So it also included were discussions of whether tribal lands were to become part of neighboring counties or its own county. Remember, Menominee contiguous, just like we are today. That was the Menominee Reservation, 1854. So what were we going to do? Was it going to be a county, or was it going to do something else? So there was a period from 1954 to about 1960 that parts of Menominee became Shawano and Oconto counties. So it was merged with the two surrounding counties. And again, just to step away from some of that verbiage, I mentioned what we were doing pre-termination. So this is a picture of our hospital. The tribe was managing its own hospital before termination. Not many tribes were doing that in the pre-1950. We had our own school. We also had infrastructure, utilities. The tribe managed its own utilities, the Menominee Utilities Program. And obviously we had forestry. We had our mill. Those were all things that we were sustaining before termination. And now, the reality is now it was time to try to figure out how to continue to sustain that without federal support and on our own dollar. So there was an entity created, Menominee Enterprise Incorporated. Now, you have to be careful, because when you all hear Menominee Enterprises, you automatically think, oh, Menominee Tribal Enterprises? No, Menominee Tribal Enterprises today was not Menominee Enterprises, Inc. during termination. Menominee Enterprises Incorporated was the corporation that was formed to conduct land sales within the reservation. Why would we do land sales within the reservation? Obviously, it was all trust land, right? So federal responsibility, those trust lands weren't taxable. So until we created lands for sale to create a tax base, there would be no tax base. And Menominee Enterprises Incorporated was fully bonded. They were managed by a 12-member board. There were only 3 Menominees on that board initially, and that started land sales within the reservation. It was hard to find enough land to imagine that a county our size would be able to sustain itself on a tax base. So MEI, Menominee Enterprises Inc., came up with a plan when approached by a developer to develop this recreational and residential project. What it consisted of was taking 8 original lakes that were here, and Ron's going to tell you about that a little bit later too. He's going to have a pretty cool visual of that. And the 8 original lakes that were here were lakes in the southeast part of the reservation. They were tribal lakes. They were lakes that were used heavily by our tribal members for subsistence. We hunted those lakes, we fished those lakes, we gathered on those lakes and lived on those lakes. So the plan was to impound those lakes and dredge channels between it and make this huge recreational lake, which became Legend Lake. And it's existing still in the southeast part of the reservation. They took 5,000 acres of land with it. The lake itself, about 1,500 acres. And these are actually pictures of that development. So these are actual pictures that were taken during the development in the 60s, early 70s of that development. So everything you heard today from other speakers and prior about our history and about our ways in living on the land and gathering, hunting, fishing was no different here. You know, even though we were on the reservation, we weren't just in communities. We were, but we were also spread out, and this was no different on these lakes. So we had many areas that were both at the time being used by tribal members, and small encampments were common, but historically as well along this lake were many historic and prehistoric areas that were used by Menominees before. You got to remember, this was the 60s, so before NEPA was ever created, unfortunately before things like the National Historic Preservation Act, before the Graves Protection Act, none of that existed then. So that's what you saw. That's what they had the ability to do. And there were many sites destroyed during this development. And also a lot of water impacted. These lakes were fed by a spring stream that flows through them. Some of that stream still exists today, but it flowed through all 8 of those lakes. And there were various springs throughout that area too that tribal members used for water that were impounded, basically flooded. Those springs are still there, they're just underwater. Really controversial, the whole darn thing. Obviously it was controversial, termination, restoration. Within the reservation, there were debates from our own people that divided families. It was amazing. So it was painful. So right there, I've got 2 uncles in there. There's family in the room here that are related to these also. So the one with the black coat and the sunglasses and holding paper is James Washnawada. He was prominent in drums, so you'll hear me talk about him a lot more in the fight against MEI. So we had a faction of folks within the reservation fighting against land sales because we knew what was happening. We knew what was going to be the end point, that our lands were going to be gone. The other person in that 2 other people in that picture, one of them's Governor Lucy with the tie, obviously. But next to him is another uncle, that's Peter Washnawada. So they were on both sides of this issue. One of them was developing because you got to remember what Legend Lake entailed was something that was going to benefit the tribe for financial reasons. And when we took away the reservation status and the tribal members that were working in various capacities within the reservation lost jobs, they literally lost jobs, and this was no different in our family. So one of them was helping to remove timber from that development because it was a job. It was a lucrative job, and there was dissension. So, and this was a common story that happened throughout. So it wasn't a pleasant period for Menominee, as you can imagine. So when we talked about drums, that organization was determined rights and unity among Menominee shareholders. So drums eventually became also, some of those members became members of our Menominee Restoration Committee, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. But drums was a entity that worked hard to push on MEI and push for control over those land sales that were occurring. There was off-reservation tribal member involvement as well. Remember I talked about assimilation in those ones that were pushed off the reservation? That was Milwaukee and Chicago. So many tribal members that lived in Milwaukee and Chicago were part of this protest effort as well. They knew what was happening and they cared what was happening. So when you think about the government's goal for assimilation was to make them non-Menominee, that didn't work because those Menominees that were in Milwaukee and Chicago and still today care about our home, cared about their culture, and got involved in this. So many families protested against termination and the sale of land within the reservation. This went on the entire time during termination. So in 71, so I'm fast forwarding a bit. In 71, they organized a march. March was to Madison. It occurred a 220-mile-long march from Kashina to Madison. The purpose was to bring media attention to the devastation and the impacts of termination. And I put that in there because it was a goal. One of the goals was media attention, but the other goal was similar to things we fought about or throughout our history. So when Chief Oshkosh and our other leaders fought for our reservation, they traveled as well. I told you, they traveled to Minnesota. They traveled to Washington. That wasn't heard of then. And it wasn't even heard of in 71 for people to do things like this. So it wasn't just a media attention thing. It was fighting for our sovereignty in our existence. So there's a picture of some tribal members that actually went on the march. It was 71, so I was a young man then. I didn't participate, but I had family in there. Obviously, many of us in this room had family in there. They took this seriously. So it wasn't something just a media ploy, I guess is my message. It was something that was serious, something that we wanted to get attention to politically as well. So restoration is in the air. All of those efforts that people were doing, Drums was doing, our young people were doing, were getting attention. The other thing that was happening as part of termination was our gathering lifestyle that initially attempts to push back. So we had a family that was still hunting and fishing in our traditional ways, which you would expect. The 1854 treaty gave us this land so we could practice those traditional ways for perpetuity. And this Termination Act felt like an interruption of that. So hunting and fishing continued, and this one family, these one individual, Sanapas, they were cited for hunting and fishing out of season. And we didn't have seasons, we had gathering, we had deer, we had bear, we had fish. So they were continuing that. So that they got representation with help from tribal leadership at the time, and this case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1968, that rule was that the Menominee treaty rights to hunt, fish, and exercise other treaty rights survived termination. So that was a big deal. That was a huge court case for us. That termination didn't abrogate our treaties. It didn't make our treaties go away. That treaties were still the law of the land. The canons of construction survived termination. So this was a huge accomplishment, and it meant a lot for not only the families that continued to practice our traditional ways, but the folks that were fighting this effort, Drums and others. So the grassroots organizations start to form along with Drums. Through lawsuits, Drums won a case that forced the restructuring of MEI. So MEI, so that tribal members had more of a say and brought control of an MEI land sale that was stripping them of Menominee lands. So they got control of some of the larger land sales, but they also got some control of Legend Lake. So they were able to stop the heavily developed areas that were happening. Legend Lake, for the most part, was done, but the bigger plan to develop that area where Legend Lake is today in our southeast part of the reservation was much more vast than it is today. Those southeast lakes would have been one large recreational area, and today it didn't get realized, partly because of what drums did and other tribal members that were fighting down there at that time. And again, I talked about James Washington. There's another picture of him. He led drums for a long time. He led that march that went to Madison, and again testified in many forums. So Madison, Washington, those testimonies helped our people be successful in this effort. So then we have the Restoration Bill. In 1971, drums worked with an attorney named Joe Proloznik. He was actually a Madison Judicare attorney at the time, but he had connections to folks in NARF, the Native American Rights Fund organization had attorneys that were working throughout Indian country during this time, both on restoration efforts, but also remember the IRA, the Indian Reorg Act, that required tribes to write constitutions. These attorneys were traveling throughout the country writing constitutions for Indian people. So Charles Wilkinson and Yvonne Knight, those NARF attorneys, came and helped us draft that restoration bill. The act was worked on for 2 years. It's no small feat. Termination didn't take a long time because there were people in Washington that were deceptive, and they had the power to do it quickly. Restoration was going to be a longer battle. So it involved a lot of consultations and community meetings with tribal members and here at home in Menominee, but again, also educating and allowing Menominee and Chicago communities, Milwaukee and Chicago communities to have a voice. Important. So in '73, the Restoration Bill was introduced in the House and Senate. Drums members paid close attention to this, obviously. Those Drums members and those Restoration Committee members, I'll show you a list of names of those ones coming up here, but they continued to be in the forefront. They continued to testify at meetings. They continued to organize. So advocates in the House and in Senate were Edward Kennedy, David Obey, and Lloyd Meads. Some of the names in history, if you look those up, were prominent in supporting us in these. Lloyd Meads was chair of the Indian Affairs Subcommittee at that time. They were able to get rid of Senator Watkins, fortunately. Field hearings were held here at home in Kashina. May of '73 was one of those big ones. And let's see, all of the Menominee Tribal members who testified were in favor of restoration. And this wasn't just related to the '73 hearing here in Kashina, but all of the testimony that was done in Madison and Washington, that trauma that we realized through those years since 1953 leading up to '70s were hard. Like I said, it took a toll, and tribal members weren't fooled by that effort, and they knew what we were going through, and they knew how hard it was, and they knew it was time to move. So testimony was unanimous. There was no tribal members within the reservation or in our neighboring communities that weren't in favor of restoration, and they spoke out. Subcommittees in DC, June of '73, 3 busloads of tribal Menominees traveled to DC, and other tribes as well traveled there to support Menominee in these efforts, because other tribes were facing these things and fighting hard as well. So the underlying success was that the bill passed the House by a vote of 404 to 3, October 16, 1973. 404 to 3. So it was definitely time. You can see that the message, the work, and all of that went into this, it got home. Senate subcommittee hearing was started with moving address, so that the Senate subcommittee in Washington had an address by one of our tribal elders at the time, Ernest McConish. I did not know Ernest McConish, but I'm sure others in the room here know that. And that opening address was moving according to our historic record. Senators Nelson, Proxmire, Kennedy, and Jackson all testified in support of the bill. So in that, the Road to Restoration, the Restoration Committee was formed. That Restoration Committee was many members of drums that took on the work to work toward restoration, the sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, the hard work that was done. A lot of you will probably recognize some of these names because they're most prominent in our history. So when you hear Sylvia Wilbur, Theodore Boyd, Ben Miller, Ada Deer, Robert Deere, Carol Dodd, Shirley Daly, you'll know that those were people that were prominent in helping us get through restoration. Now, that said, you heard me talk a lot about other people as well. They were still there. They were still fighting, just not in the forefront as much as these ones were. And that fight with folks like James Washnawada continued, and the hard work behind the scenes to get us through to restoration continued. And there were hundreds of other Menominees that were working really hard on this as well. So it wasn't, just the most prominent people and the names you hear in our history, albeit they did the hard upfront work. There were many, many Menominees working on this effort to get us to our success. 1973 Restoration Act signed by President Nixon. So again, Nixon was, overall history, bad rap, of course, right? So Nixon in our history pretty much, looked at as somebody that cared about Menominee people and cared about restoration and got us through and successfully helped us get through to a time that was a lot of trauma. So the Wisconsin Supreme Court, after restoration, also restored control of hunting and fishing to the Menominee. That happened in about 1976. So as a young man growing up here and a hunter-fisher, I remember those days when our reservation was open. It wasn't just tribal members hunting and fishing here. It was an open reservation. We had many, many people coming here hunting and fishing. It was really strange to see. Also, the development was really strange to see, because being a hunter and visiting those sites like the southeast part of the reservation that became Legend Lake, it looked quite different from my memory. Places that were forested before were turned into moonscapes. They looked like sand dunes out there where we normally duck hunted. And there were all kinds of people running around that. No idea who they were. So that kind of trauma wasn't just social, it was it was cultural, and it affected everybody from our young to our old. So we began reforming tribal government at that time. The tribal constitution was adopted and ratified in 1977. So a tribal constitution that we still go by today. This same constitution that was adopted and ratified in 77, the same constitution that we're governed by today. Is it good? Not always. It's. You heard Jennifer talk about this last night. What's better? Our clan structure form of government, our general council form of government, or this Western type of organized government that a lot of tribes, including Menominee, are living by today. Those are results of the government oppression and government attempts to assimilate us over time that were results of this. And the termination period resulted in that. So there's pieces of trauma in our tribe that are carried on today like this that are still prevalent. We're still recovering from this. Still a huge fight. The other part of our constitution, I mentioned a little bit, the Menominee Restoration Committee at the time of tribal reform in government and adopted ratified constitution, that restoration committee those members became our first tribal legislature. So our first tribal legislature was seated in 1979. We had a school. We started our own school in 76. So the Menominee School District started in 1976. Sorry, the Menominee School started in 1976. After all those years, a lot of us that attended schools off the reservation in Shawano and Gresham other places. It was time to have our own school. So I was lucky enough to start in '76 as a sophomore. Not surprised, I ended up in tribal government because I led the school government at the time. And what we did was about 6 of us organized at our high school a ceremony to welcome those new tribal legislatures. So in our high school gym, we had that swearing-in ceremony in 1979, where all of us that were in school at the time got to witness the first tribal legislature. So that was kind of cool, and I think a lot of other people that were in school government at the time thought the same. There's a picture of Richard Nixon after the signing. So that success meant that our reservation was back to federal status. You can see this sign today at our reservation boundaries, not this very one, but we try to signage all of our reservation boundaries. So we let people know when you're entering our reservation that that's where you are. Menominee Indian Reservation. This one's pretty cool because pursuant to the Menominee Restoration Act, December 22nd, 1973, pretty historic day for us. We still celebrate that. We still celebrate that today. It's a really important historic day for us. You can see below that, no camping or fishing. Today we're a closed reservation. We have our own tribal laws for hunting, fishing, gathering. There is some non-member hunting and fishing, but it's strictly descendants of our own tribal members and spouses. So we're a closed reservation today, and again, it's not a surprise after some of the trauma we've been through. Restoration's occurring. So I put this slide in there just to remind me to talk about that. And again, I talked about our school. We have our own district now, brand new high school, just built this year. So if you haven't seen it, watch across the road when you leave. It's pretty amazing. Language revitalization is massive. You heard Jennifer talk to you about that last night. Our language is, we were losing our language, not just because of termination, but many government attempts that I talked about previous to that, from the time of pre-treaty times right up to modern times. There's been attempts to eliminate that from tribal culture. So that restoration is going on for the tribe. It's a huge effort. We're down to a very few traditional Menominee speakers. So that's one thing that we're working on hard. And it has tremendous support. The other things in natural resources we're doing, you heard Ron talk about, and his tour yesterday, the forest work continues. We're doing restoration because it's ever changing. It's not, if we listen to the forest, it'll tell us what to do, certainly. But we do have to listen to the lessons we learned in some of those areas that historically were areas that were important to us, and we need to bring some of them back. And it's not always just about the way the forest was always managed. It's evolving. We have to evolve with it. So there's that. Lake sturgeon restoration, we're doing that from the natural resource side. These dams that were put up below the reservation weren't coincidence either. We had massive ties to lake sturgeon in our culture and our history. They're a part of our creation story, and those were stopped when dams were built, and termination didn't help very much. So we're today have a really good effort going on restoration of lake sturgeon. Wild rice as well. Omatnomanawak, that's our name. Menominees are Omatnomanawak. That name means people of the wild rice. And through all the development that occurred within our reservation boundaries, through development in general, it impacts rice, and we lost a lot of our rice. Our historical levels will never be reached again here on the reservation because of development, because it's just so hard to do. But we're undertaking them efforts, and it's working somewhat. Again, we have a lot of people helping us with that. And socially, the restoration is something that we're working hard on. Trauma-informed care is something we implement in all facets of our learning and our teaching. So when people come on in our employ, we train them in trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is basically a model of healing. It's how do we heal from that trauma that we've all experienced, from little ones up to the elders, and it's still happening today. So that model we're using for trauma-informed care is practice in our healthcare, practice in our schools, it's practice in our employees. So it's something that we're trying to do to get through that. And it's successful. You know, we're seeing successes today. We're seeing a lot of building, not structures, but socially. You heard Jennifer talk about that very well last night. And again, you've heard it in your time here, in your tours. So them are things that are going on, coming out of these times, and positive things are happening. Things like family centers that are open, available to our tribal members 24 hours to use, and better law enforcement agencies, better history development. You know, Dave's program over there, that's just witness, amazing place. You know, they're doing amazing things. So them are all things that we're building toward in positive ways to get through this. So I had these resources up there. These were all used in the presentation. And if you haven't seen some of these, you know, take a look. Nicholas Peroff, 1982, that Menominee Drums, Tribal Termination and Restoration Publications, that excellent one. If you haven't read it, pick it up and read it. You'll get a lot more detail than I even gave you here today. So thanks to the Historic Preservation Department. Environmental Services helped also, but a good friend of mine, Chris Goodwill, she's a program attorney for the tribe. She's an attorney that's worked throughout Indian country. She did a lot of this work in this presentation. She's given this presentation to the bar in Wisconsin, and she helped out a lot with that, so thank you, Chris. Hopefully I stayed within my time.
If termination affected the day-to-day practices of the Menominee Tribal enterprises, the forestry operation at all, or if they were able to continue doing what they were doing?
The good thing about the forest was it was so recognized, and that sustainability was so important that it survived a lot of termination. The state helped with that, so during termination, the state came in and helped with management, but not with an intent to clear cut, not with an intent to take timber for financial reasons. Our sustainability was still a key factor. There's some legislation that was enacted during termination as well that related to forestry, just like I mentioned with the court cases for natural resources. So yeah, it was amazing that fortunate that we were recognized the way we were, that we took care of the forest the way we did. I think they were a little afraid of Menominee too.
One more. What remains of the Legend Lake development?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Legend Lake was developed. So the 1,500 acre lake was fully developed, parceled all around it. I don't remember the number of parcels, but most of those parcels were created at 110 feet. So fee simple parcels. That's all there yet today. The lake along the shoreline is entirely developed, except for a few areas that were reserved that had large wetlands. So those couldn't be developed, but basically the lake's entirely developed, housing around the lake. Over time, the tribe was able to start buying back some of those lands, and we're still doing that today. So those parcels, when they come up for sale, the ones that are affordable, the tribe is buying those back and turning them back to trust. So slowly we're starting to get at that, but it's still 5,000 acres chunked out of our reservation that we're fighting hard to try to get back.
One more.
How did the non-Menominee public react to closing the reservation after restoration? Were there issues, I'm guessing?
I don't have any knowledge of non-Menominees reacting negatively
There wasn't any
to restoration.
anger about closing off the hunting and camping is what I'm curious about.
I don't have any history of that. I don't know if Dave or anybody else in the room does that lived through the period also, but I don't have any. You know, we were hunters, fishers heavily, my family, and my father particularly had friends that during termination be invited in, and we would fish with them, particularly on the rivers for trout. When restoration happened, that stopped, and, you know, we still remained friends with those people that my father pretended to have gone on, but I never heard them complain.
I think with that